Thanks for being with us again today, everyone, for another exciting round of Leader to Leader. I see everyone's doing introductions in the chat, which is fantastic. And we just want to make sure that everybody knows that we will be recording this. And so you'll have an opportunity to, engage with it later or share it with someone else that maybe should have been here and missed out on this great discussion. We're expecting about 300 of our closest friends to be joining us today. So we see that you're rolling in right now. And as we're welcoming people, I did note that MASSP's president, Andy Kowalczyk from Bay City, is with us. So welcome, Andy. And thanks for being with us. Other members of the MASSP Board of Directors as well. Always good to have you with us. So as we get started here, I see that you are posing in the chat. Those of you that are just kind of logging in and joining us, if you'll just state your name, your school district, and what your position is, that would be absolutely fantastic. I think we're ready to jump on to the next slide. We'll go ahead and get started because I know we have a very full agenda with our panelists today. So as we go through things, if you are going to pose a question, instead of posing that question in the chat, if you would put that in the Q&A, that would be very helpful. We want to be able to access those questions and to be able to go through those and make sure that we don't miss any, so they don't get jumbled in the chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A. You can find the Q&A right at the bottom of your page. If you just kind of put your cursor there, you'll see the chat and you'll see the Q&A. We will also be recording this, and when we record it, we'll post that recording and we'll also post the slide deck.
Keep in mind that this webinar is based on information that we have as of noon today. And so as we go through today, just note that we are basing it on the latest emergency orders that are available, as well as current statute that applies to today's topic around teacher evaluation. And that although Kevin Sutton is with us from Miller Johnson and is an attorney, please don't take anything we say today as official client privileged content that you need to do. Each of your districts have a retainer with a law firm, and so you would need to specifically look to them as for guidance on anything that's particular to one-on-one. But we do want to provide context for you today, provide you some direction. So we're going to have a combination of both content reminders as well as some practical examples and suggestions on how to proceed around this topic. Before we get started, though, please do note we do have Kevin Sutton here, as I mentioned. Wendy, obviously, thank you for the welcome. I'm Colin Ripmaster. We have Steve Seward, who's going to be wrapping us up today around how to proceed with observation feedback, and Bob Kefgen, who's going to be our play-by-play director as we move forward around the statute. He is going to start with a brief update on some current legislative pieces specific to MIOSHA and MDAHS guidance as far as, or not guidance, but emergency orders. So thank you for joining us today. And as Wendy said, if you have questions that come up, please do add those to the Q&A and not the chat so that we're able to log those. Following this, we will be emailing people a copy of the recording as well as links to the resources and posting those as well as on our website. So with that, Bob, we know that COVID-19 continues to persist, and we had some recent orders come out on Sunday that went into effect as of yesterday. So the whole idea around pausing to save lives, give us the lowdown on what that has to do with schools.
Thanks, Colin. And yeah, so if I'm a play-by-play commentator, what we're looking at here is the Spartans' defense. It's a shut it down approach that we're taking right now. So what came out most recently is the MDHHS order. It came out November 15th, opening day, for those of you who appreciate the beard. And it took effect yesterday, November 18th. And it really changed a bunch of things. It didn't go totally back to where we were back in the spring, but it moved us back in that direction. So the things that are open are some very limited gatherings. And that was probably the biggest shift, was the change in number of people allowed to gather at a time, both in public spaces, but also residentially. So public gatherings in indoor spaces are now entirely prohibited for social gatherings, and only limitedly allowed for non-social gatherings. You have to have a specific exemption for certain gatherings. You can do residential gatherings, but only 2 households and no more than 10 people. And you can do some small outdoor gatherings up to 25 people, but no more than 3 households. And this was really a response to what the state has been seeing in terms of the most recent COVID numbers, which suggest that a lot of the spread is coming from social gatherings, particularly residential social gatherings. Unlike the spring when retail was shut down entirely, when bars and restaurants were closed entirely, there are a lot of workplaces still open, including schools, but they are not, but they're operating under different rules and different restrictions. And for schools especially, this is what that looks like. This is what it boils down to. For pre-K-8, you can have in-person instruction, but no extracurriculars and no athletics. In grades 9 through 12, there's no in-person instruction, but you can have and no extracurriculars and no athletics. But in all grades, you can continue in-person instruction for special education students and English language learners. And if you're looking at the language of the order, I want to be clear that it says special education students, not students with disabilities. So that's a distinction. English language learners, there's no definition of who constitutes an English language learner, no WIDA level that you have to worry about. So anybody that would fall under that definition seems to be covered. The other big piece of this is this bit from MIOSHA, and this is not new. It's just been highlighted as part of the most recent order, but this has been in effect for a number of weeks now. And what MIOSHA has put in place is a requirement for employers to prohibit in-person work unless it is not feasible for the person to do their work remotely. And so what does it mean to be feasible? What is feasible? What can be done remotely? Well, I thought this quote from the Keeping a Safe Workplace document issued on November 6th by MIOSHA probably had the most comprehensive or clearest explanation that I was able to find. It means that a worker is unable to physically complete their required job tasks from a remote setting, but it should not be construed as permitting in-person work solely because working remotely may result in decreased productivity or efficiency, or because there may be additional costs like having to buy technology. In other words, remote work to the greatest extent possible unless extenuating circumstances make it so that you cannot do your job in person. Kevin, I know you guys had your own take on this. Why don't you jump in at this point and share what you guys have put out?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well and staying safe. The phones have been ringing off the hook for the last couple of weeks, in particular with respect to this MIOSHA piece. And this word feasibility has gotten a lot of attention. And initially, after issuing these rules, the MIOSHA rules in mid-October, there was an FAQ that came out that was very deferential to employers. And it basically said, look, you know, we're not going to question your business judgment. If you think you need to have people in person, that's okay. You're just going to have to give us an explanation why. I sort of likened it to an arbitrary and capricious standard, right? If we could give a basic explanation of why we had people there, it was okay. They got more in line, though, with what DHHS was doing, and they took away that FAQ, and they've come out with this much more restrictive language. And I think it's a very clear shift in interpretation and application. I think it took a little longer than any school lawyer would have liked for MIOSHA and then DHHS to get on the same page, because it seemed like they worked on the same page there for a week or two, and the guidance was a little bit conflicting. The way I'm thinking about this is not necessarily feasibility, but infeasibility. If it's infeasible for you to work at home, then you can work at work. But otherwise, you need to be working at home unless it's infeasible to do so. And I think Bob highlights something really important. I think we've got enough experience now, and I've got a wife upstairs who's doing it remotely as well. We know it can be more efficient to be in the building. Certainly there are synergies and efficiencies to be gained by being in the building. And what MIOSHA is telling us here is that's not enough. Yeah, we get that it might be more efficient to be at work, but that's not good enough. If you don't have internet at home, if you're physically incapable of doing your job from home, those are reasons to be inside, because it's infeasible for you to work from home. But otherwise, we want people home. And MIOSHA did a live question and answer earlier this week, somewhat helpful. They just kept saying over and over again, we really don't want people at work. And so that's how we're looking at it. There will be limited exceptions where people can be at work because it is infeasible for them to be at home. But otherwise, the push here is to have people be at home. And that's how we've interpreted it so far.
And if anybody really wants it, I took the MIOSHA Q&A that they did and cut it down from a half an hour to 6 minutes. And it's the guy from MIOSHA repeating himself over and over and over again in slightly different words for 6 full minutes.
So as principals, as teachers, as support staff, we should be working at home unless it's unfeasible for you to be there. So as you keep thinking forward, be thinking about what might those other employees do that aren't facilitating remote instruction. What might they do from home, whether it's contact tracing, whether it's providing resources, whether it's checking in, and similar to what you did in the spring, that really they need to be doing that from a remote environment. And so that's an important.
Could we just for a minute think about maybe the flip side of that, Kevin, specifically? Like, you know, if you have a teacher who says, geez, I just don't have reliable internet at home, or I'm going to be conducting a science experiment, and it would really be helpful if I could be in my classroom to utilize that space. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and of course, Wendy, those are the questions that I'm getting here the last couple of days, these ones that really fall into this gray area. And I don't want to say that it's going to be a case of how people frame it, because we shouldn't have to be using particular terms. But, you know, I've had someone say, look, I've got 2 kids under the age of 3. They're high energy. They're running all over the place. My parents are here trying to watch them. I've got a really small house. I cannot effectively teach from home. I just can't do it. I cannot deliver quality instruction. In that case, I said, okay, that person cannot feasibly work from home, as opposed to the person who's like, yeah, I got a nice setup at home. I got a nice setup at work. I just prefer to go to work because I want to get away from my kids for 8 hours. And that's not really infeasible for working at home. So, you know,
speak for yourself, Kevin.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to say it's about using the right terminology, because I'm not trying to push people to use, you know, certain buzzwords, but I think we really have to do a little bit for these people that want to be in the building. We've got to do a little bit of a case-by-case analysis. And what is the case? Do you really not have reliable internet, or do you really just want to get out of the house for a few hours? I mean, at the end of the day, Bob's right. The MIOSHA guy, God bless him, sort of said the same thing over and over again. Be thoughtful, be thoughtful, be thoughtful. We really got to try, unless there's a good reason to have them in the building, to keep them at home. Doesn't mean that they're all going to be at home, but it's got to be more than just sort of a whim and not wanting to be there.
Yeah, and I think the follow-up to that too is just making sure that if you do have that allowance for some staff to report, that there's protocols in place for that. And that as they're coming in, they're taking their temperature and they're signing in, so that you have a log of who's been in the building, and just kind of standard best practices, I'm sure, by this point in time.
Absolutely.
Kevin, just real quickly, can you talk about the documentation that districts have to have in order to show that employees need to be at work for a particular reason? I remember the MIOSHA guy going over that, and there were at least a couple things you had to document, right?
Yeah, and I'll try to be really brief, but I mean, they put out this idea, MIOSHA, that each district has to adopt a policy which prohibits in-person work. And that's the thesis, a policy that prohibits in-person work unless otherwise allowed. First of all, it doesn't have to be a policy, because policy means that it's got to be adopted by the board. We don't believe that to be the case. We think this is more of a procedure. And what the board, or what the district needs to do, is lay out this procedure for, look, we know that we generally don't want to have people here. These are the factors that we're going to look at. These are the factors that we're going to consider. And then they're going to need to thoughtfully go through and assess different employee groups and say, well, these people, you know, they're going to have to be here. These people, we don't really need to have them here. And they're going to have to articulate that and have that as a procedure. And so most districts are very busy this week trying to figure out what that language is going to look like, doing those individual assessments as it relates to employee groups, and then advising the employee groups. And then shortly thereafter, debating with the union about where people fall, about who should come and who shouldn't come. And, you know, there are MIOSHA complaints floating around out there. There are union grievances floating around out there. And everybody's just trying to do the best they can and comply with what MIOSHA and MDHHS are telling us. But you're gonna hear that phrase, remote work policy, remote work procedure. You're gonna hear that here if you haven't already over the next week or so, and it's gonna be aimed at just figuring out who are we gonna let come to the building and who are we not gonna let come to the building. But understand the thesis from MIOSHA is you should have a policy and procedure that prohibits in-person work, and that's gonna be the slant of it while giving the district some discretion.
Thanks, Kevin.
So the question was asked that the governor has stressed that we have K-8 education in person. Of course, these students could be taught at home as well, even though it's not as good. How is it okay for teachers to come in and teach it in one building in a district with kids and not allow them to come home in another? And I think that's an important piece as we think about this, that yes, they're looking at the science and contagions are less between students that are younger than older. And we also know there's childcare issues and safety pieces that way as well. But I think, Kevin, one of the things you've mentioned is this idea around how teachers are carriers as well and how that's impacting from there. So how might you rectify that communication amongst teachers in different buildings?
Yeah, welcome to my nightmare, right? Because, and I give the governor and her team credit. I mean, they're looking at the data, right? And just as you said, Colin, safer with the younger kids than with the older kids, plus generally, you know, fewer activities and whatnot. And so they're saying, yeah, K-8 can stay open. Well, you've also got the dynamic of having elementary teachers that are showing up and saying, why are my high school colleagues at home? And I'm here with kids that I could potentially be getting sick. We've been done no favors in terms of trying to manage those dynamics. And frankly, every superintendent and every board member I've talked to, they're exasperated and they're not sure what to do. And now, unfortunately, right now, with where we're at, a lot of them are just going remote K-12, right? I mean, everybody's going to go home. And the part of the reason they're doing that is to eliminate this dynamic, because you absolutely have unions out there that are saying, wait a minute, I don't really care what the governor says. This is BS, frankly, that I've got a group of my teachers that are in buildings and a group of my teachers that are at home under the same order. It doesn't make any sense. And so to solve that, a lot of districts are just going total remote. If they don't, the pushback is we're allowed to be open and we think it's in kids' best interest. I won't say that will appease the unions, and certainly my week has been filled with lots of complaints in that regard. So there's not really, frankly, Colin, a good way to message it. It sort of, unfortunately, is what it is, and we're doing the best we can, and that's all we can really say.
A second question, if you might be able to give us guidance on, is one, does the request for in-person work by individual employees need to be completed daily, or can it be for a range of dates on one form? And secondly, is there a place that this needs to be submitted?
Yeah, most districts are creating forms that they want employees to submit. To my knowledge, there's no requirement that it be on a daily basis. I think most of them have looked at doing a range of time, if for no other reason than to minimize the already mountain of paperwork and protocol that is associated with this time in our lives. But I think a range of times is acceptable, and I think each district will be able to set where that goes. My suspicion is that most would want to do that in somewhat of a centralized way through human resources, as opposed to doing it at the building level. And I think ultimately those decisions need to be made at the centralized level.
All right, thank you. So shifting forward then beyond the MIOSHA, we have all this stuff around educator evaluation. So Bob, why don't you kick off our...
Yeah, so let's talk educator evaluations here. And as we think about this, we're going to do a quick 101 on educator evals. This is a presentation that we could spend half a day on. We're going to do it in about 40 minutes. So understand that it is a pretty basic overview, but we're going to cover some overarching requirements and then the other pieces as well. Overarching requirements for evaluation: remember that your system has to be rigorous, transparent, and fair. You have to evaluate job performance at least annually. You need to provide timely and constructive feedback. You need to have clear approaches to measuring student growth, and you are stuck with 4 rating categories. These are overarching requirements that apply to all evaluation systems in the state. The major components of your evaluation then are these pieces here: 40% student growth, half of which has to be based on state growth data in tested grades and subjects, that is 4 through 8 ELA and math. The other 60% is based on educator practice, though there is a requirement in there that you need to account for the Section 1248 factors with any remaining portion of your evaluation. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about those factors.
And just to clarify, in most people's, or in most districts, those 1248 factors, or sometimes referred to as BB factors, are often integrated within your district adopted tool. So it may not be something you need to do separately based on which framework you're using.
So let's dig a little bit deeper on that student growth piece. The 40% student growth is for all teachers, and it's at 40% now. It's not at 25%. There's been no move to change that percentage that's gotten any sort of legs so far. So you better be planning for 40% growth. And in those tested grades and subjects, that is 4th through 8th grade, English language arts and math, half of those data need to come from state assessments. Now, how exactly you're going to do that when you won't have MSTEP data in time for this year's evals, and you don't have last year's data? I think Colin's going to get a little bit deeper in what that could look like and different ways to handle it. What I will say, though, is that remember that no matter which growth you're doing, whether it's a tested grade or subject or not, the measures you use, you have to have more than one measure. You have to have multiple measures for student growth. And those measures need to be comparable across schools within the district. That is, if you have multiple elementary schools and you're doing student growth comparisons across those elementary schools, you need to make sure that your growth measures are consistent. Same with multiple high schools, multiple middle school campuses. You're muted, Colin.
What's important to keep in mind is that there's a lot of local control when it comes to making decisions about student growth. Although the state does tell you the proportion of the evaluation that needs to be based on student growth, currently 40%, and that 50% for K-8, or excuse me, 4th through 8th grade ELA and math teachers must be based on state assessment, that's the limit to what they say it has to include. From there, it's all local control. So as a district, you can determine the type of measures you're going to use for 4th through 8th grade teachers for the other 20%. For K-12 teachers, the entire 40% is a local control on what measures you use, as long as you're using 2 or more. Secondly, it doesn't tell you what the model or approach is to how you use the student growth. That's a local control, as well as what criteria you use to evaluate that, how you aggregate it, and how you attribute it. So as you think about student growth, be thinking about what student growth measures do you have available. So for particular our middle level people, you know that you have to be using a benchmark assessment right now, and you have to administer it multiple times a year. So there are many districts that are using that, whether it's NWA MAPS or one of these others that are out here, as a way to do a pre and post to be able to measure student growth. At the secondary level, you might be using local benchmark assessments or one of these as well as part of that piece. Keeping in mind that the model could be an improvement or performance index, which are similar to what we often use in school improvement, like what % of our students met or exceeded a target, or what % of our students are proficient. And then we also have growth measures, whether that be pre to post tests, whether those be SLOs or growth to proficiency or some type of student growth percentile model, whether it's aggregate or conditional or a traditional student growth in percentile or VAM. So as a district, you can determine that as you go. Secondly, you get to decide what makes something ineffective, minimally effective, effective, or highly effective. So we've put out in the past, and MDE has supported these models here and some of these scoring bands. But as a local district, you have the opportunity to determine which ones to use and what are those breakpoints between levels of that. So that's something, just like in a classroom as a teacher, there may be times that given circumstances you grade on a curve or you adjust your grading scale based on the performance of your students or the conditions within your classroom. Third, you determine how you aggregate growth. So let's say going back in time to 2017-18, you had a pre and a post test and you looked at what % of our students met it. And then you provided a rating. And then over time, you had those 3 years of data. In some schools, they looked at it and just averaged the % of students going. And in other schools, they looked at the rating itself. So in this case, you have the opportunity to determine which of these aggregate, whether the % meeting target or not, whether it's the averaging of ratings. And so as you go back in time and think about how you can collect that data from 3 years or what's available, that's another opportunity for you to go. And then here's the success criteria as one example. And so in this case, that comes into that effective range. The other part that you have is around attribution. So as you think about attribution, are you going to attribute an individual score from students just to their individual teachers? Or might you look at shared attribution where you're going to attribute these scores to a group of teachers, which is what many schools have been doing now as a way to be able to minimize the discrepancies between scores, knowing that a larger pool and knowing that a larger group of students had or teachers contributed to that performance. One way you might think about this, if you're a middle level person, and I would say for elementary as well, is just go to My School Data. And if you go to My School Data and you click on the K-12 grade, you're going to have state testing show up, and you can look at multiple ways to do it. A simple way to do it is to look to the student growth that's already calculated by the state by grade level and discipline. And so when clicking on that, I'm able to select my district from within my ISD district and school. I can pick the school year, the grade levels, the subjects, and the report category, and it will give me a report. So in this case, I took a middle school, and that middle school scores over the last 3 years, and this one is for English language arts. And what you'll notice is at the end, it gives me the mean SGP, or student growth percentile. So if I want to use the student growth percentile, which is the model that MDE has supported and recommended for use, I can look to the far right and I can see either for all grades. So if I want to do a shared attribution amongst all teacher in my middle school, regardless of discipline, I could use that piece. If I want to look at it specifically for 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade, I'm able to pull that data into a simple chart. And within that simple chart, I can lay out how my students performed in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and as a school for the whole. So I now could either attribute to an entire grade level or to an entire building based on the data that's available. If you notice, the data available most recently is 2018 and 19 because of the suspension of testing in 2019 and 20. So as a local district, you might determine that the 3 most recent years of data are the 3 I have here, or you might say the 3 most recent year of data that's available are just the 2 years from 2017-18 and 2018-19. So as a district, you determine what that most recent 3 years is, and you determine what's available. But in this case, I can use the simple student growth percentile chart that was provided, and I can look to what the effectiveness rating would be. And in this case, it falls within that effective range. So we could attribute that to a grade level or an entire building. And by doing so, everybody's getting the same score within that grade level or building, which then will mitigate for the student growth's impact when it comes to the final effectiveness rating for layoff and recall and other pieces that from high stakes accountability people are looking at. Another way to think about this is around college readiness within our high school. So if you click on from this area and you go to the college readiness score, you can click on the trends tab and it will bring that data up. So in this case, for a high school that we've worked with, you can see the data from 2016 to 2018. And along the right, you'll see what % of students met the college readiness score or exceeded the college readiness score in the total score from SAT, as well as the total or the evidence-based reading and writing and the math score. So in this case, I can look at it from a couple different perspectives. One perspective is to look at just purely the % of students that met the standard. And so in this case, for 2018-19, it was 53.3 for the total score, 50.7 for 17-18, and 54% for 16-17. So I can see the trajectory. Or I could use the improvement model that looks at what % change happened, and that's what I listed in parentheses. In averaging those 3 scores, I'm able to look at it from, in this case, a negative 0.7% change overall as an average for total versus negative 4.4 for EBR, and then for math. And then I could look to this. And unfortunately, in this case, that one went to the minimally effective category. Whereas if I would have gone from simple growth, it would have been in the ineffective. But going back to show you how this could work, in our scores, I could change what my scoring criteria is for that. So in this case, if I said less than 40% meeting the benchmark is ineffective, and 40 to 50 and so on, you can see how we're able to adjust from that. So as a local district, this is within your control in how you do that.
So moving past growth to some of the other requirements in the statute, just a quick reminder that you should already have IDPs in place for all of your probationary teachers and anyone rated less than effective in their 2019-20 school year. But keep in mind that you're still going to have to be doing IDPs for those folks. If you didn't, they need to be developed by an administrator in consultation with the teacher. They have to include specific performance goals and any recommended PD or support that you're going to need or that those teachers will need. And that leads into also the mid-year reviews, which is probably the next big thing coming up that building principals need to be worrying about. Those mid-year reviews are need to be aligned with a teacher's IDP. You need to base their mid-year review, at least in part, on student achievement, include specific goals for the remainder of the school year, and you need to provide a written improvement plan developed by you, the administrator, but in consultation with the teacher, and include, again, that recommended training. So who needs a mid-year review? Very simply, mid-year review needs to
be any teacher that was less than effective on their last evaluation and every first-year teacher. So as a district, you were supposed to come up with that piece. So if you were first-year probationary, you have an IDP that you created for that teacher this fall. And if you're rated less than effective, then you were supposed to have an IDP created for that teacher by June 30th of last year. All probationary teachers may have a mid-year review, as any teacher could, but it's not required that all probationary. It's all first-year probationary teacher, and any teacher rated less than effective shall have that evaluation, knowing that best practice is that all teachers would benefit from that. And I think that's an important piece when you think about your stance and your approach to this. The purpose of the mid-year review isn't to evaluate teachers. It's not to get them or catch them doing bad. The whole point of the mid-year review is to help teachers understand where they stand now and what opportunities and support might they need moving forward. So when you think about pandemic learning and people working out of Zooms and Meets and Hangouts and all these other things, think about how lonely that can be for a teacher. And it's in an environment that isn't their native place for growing their practice. So as an administrator, one of the ways you can support your teacher, and Steve's going to talk about this a little bit later, is through observation and feedback. A second way to be able to do this is through mid-year reviews. Thinking about where you were last spring and how pandemic learning went. How is it different now? So simply asking, how has your practice grown over the course of this semester? Knowing what you did from the spring to what you've done now, how has your practice grown? What impacts it had on student learning? What might you focus on next during the second half of the year that would help to impact student learning and grow your practice? And ultimately, what might you need or appreciate from me as your observer in order to grow that practice? Imagine if in December or in January and you have a staff meeting and you're going through this and you have teachers just do some simple reflections, maybe in a Google Doc or in a Google form, and they're identifying for you. So when you come in for the meeting with the teacher, you're able to do a more thoughtful approach, but it's not about rating the teacher. It's not about saying, well, your kids are at this % proficient. It's how are they growing? And what might need to take place between now and May to help bridge the gap in their achievement so they're ready for that next grade level.
Hey, Colin, before we move on, there were a couple of questions on IDPs. Did we clearly say that the IDP is for any teacher in their first year of their probationary period?
So let me clarify. All teachers who are probationary, so any teacher in their first 5 years of teaching within your district are probationary teachers unless they have 3 consecutive years of highly effective, and then it's just their first 4 years. So any teacher that's new in your district should have an IDP. Any teacher that was rated less than effective last year must have an IDP. So that's the part about the IDP that they must have. From the second part then is who must have a mid-year review. Mid-year reviews are for minimum requirement is a first-year teacher and anybody less than effective. The intention from the legislator was saying that for probationary teachers in their second, third, fourth, and fifth year, you know where they were. So maybe if they were rated effective last year, there wouldn't be any surprises. But we want to make sure that a first-year teacher at minimum has at least one point in time to know, am I on track for being renewed going into my second year or not? And what do I need to do to continue to work within this district and meet your expectation? The second part then was for those who were rated less than effective. And so that's why it's mandatory for them. If they were less than effective last year, did I make enough progress to date to continue employment, to move out of that ineffective or minimally effective area? And if not, what do I need to do between now and the end of the years to close the gap between my present level of performance and the beginning? The whole intention of this law is to ensure there's no surprises, first, and second, that we're supporting teachers wherever they are to build their craft. This is why we believe it's important that all teachers have the opportunity and the support of their administrators to think about this from that lens, knowing that all of us are in a different place of effectiveness this year during a pandemic than we might have been if we were in a traditional face-to-face. But minimum first-year teacher probationary and anybody less than effective have to have a mid-year review. All probationary teachers and all less than effective teachers must have an IDP.
Remember also that a teacher who had tenure in a previous district and moved into your district remains probationary for either their first 2 years or until the board votes to waive their probationary period.
And so as a district, you have local control to do beyond the minimums. And I think that addresses the second question that's there.
So let's talk observations briefly. Because that's the other bit of this that you guys are dealing with right now. Remember that during an observation, you have to review the lesson plan, the curriculum standards that are being covered in that lesson, and the pupil engagement in the lesson. That's the minimum you need to cover within that observation. You also need to have feedback to your teachers within 30 days of conducting an observation, whether it's you conducting the observation or someone else doing it. You do not have to be there and observe them for an entire class period. It can be a portion of a class period, whatever you guys can fit in. But you do have to have at least 2 observations for each teacher. The only exception is teachers who had 2 consecutive effective or highly effective evaluations. You don't need 2 observations for them. You could get away with just 1 observation. That said, best practice is definitely at least 2 observations, one of which the law requires is unscheduled. And the person doing the teacher's final evaluation has to complete one of those observations.
The other thing I want to remind people of is on their district website, they have posting and assurances. And in most cases, those posting and assurances note the number of observations that are necessary in order to ensure validity, reliability, and efficacy. So there's oftentimes a little gap between the minimum requirement of the state and what's needed for the requirements for your posting assurances. So be mindful of that as you move forward. Steve, oftentimes when we think about the law, we hear about, oh, I'm doing an evaluation today. And what we come to find out is it's more observation. So even culturally, we know there's language matters and our approach makes a difference. Can you talk to us more about the practical and what teachers might need and appreciate and how we might approach it?
So let's think about this. The ultimate purpose of observation and evaluation is to grow teacher practice, to have a positive impact on student achievement. So when we're working alongside teachers, we're observing, we're not evaluating. We only evaluate or provide a score at the end of the year. Otherwise, we're observing and we're providing formative feedback to grow the practice of the teacher to have an impact on student achievement. So if you haven't changed your language yet, please do that. That we're observing practice, we're not evaluating, because that right there will set a teacher off sometimes and cause them to go into stress mode so that they can't think critically around how to teach in front of those students when you're in their zone. So also think about this. What is your outcome with teacher observation evaluation? Is it to create a partner or an opponent? because oftentimes our approach can create an opponent versus a partnership. The first thing we want to think about is it's all about the conversation. So it's not going in and causing judgment. It's going in to talk about what's happening, why is it happening, and why is the teacher choosing these methods or strategies, and then supporting them and creating a relationship alongside them and their students. It's all about reflection. Thinking forward, thinking back, what's working, what's not working, and also zeroing things on a strengths-based stance. So we're looking at what a teacher can do, not what they can't do or what they are not doing. So we're finding the strength and we're building upon that. It's also about this, folks, reciprocal learning. That if we're expecting teachers to learn at this vertical climb, we have to learn at this vertical climb as well. So they're giving us feedback, we're giving them feedback, we're working together as a partnership to make this cohesive and make it work, making people want to show up at work versus going in and telling people, here's where you rate or here's where I see you. Let's come to that collaboratively of where do you see yourself? And then we can agree or disagree with the person, and we can come to an agreement about where the person lives and what supports they need to go forward in their craft. The other one that's up there is let's act as a thought partner versus a judge. Like, I'm not an expert at any of this stuff. I play around with it, but I'm not an expert at all. I don't know if you are, but it's hard for me to give people feedback in this realm because I haven't lived it. So why wouldn't I just be a thought partner with folks? The other one is it has to be focused on a goal. We have to ask the teachers, what do you want to work on this year? What are 3 to 5 areas of focus to go into this year? And let's work upon those to get to the person to goal. If we're looking at the entirety of our rubric, every time we go in, there's no way we can see all of that and give feedback on all of that. Let's go through a micro lens and say, what does a teacher need? What do they want to work on? And then how do we work within that zone? The other thing is it has to be predictable. They have to know why we're coming in and what it's going to look like. Am I going to provide them feedback within 24 hours? Is it going to be face-to-face? Is it going to be written? What's the process look like? And what are my behaviors going to be in this relationship, as well as what are their behaviors? And how can we work together to make this work?
An important part of this whole piece goes right back to your disposition in your mindset that Steve talked about, a partner or an opponent. As leaders, we need to know that it's beyond just their content knowledge and the skills they were taught and they developed over their experience in a classroom face-to-face with students. There are new skills to facilitating learning, and it requires a disposition to think differently. How do we transfer these best practices that we did face-to-face into a remote way? So how are we using chats? How are we using breakout rooms? How are we using Google Docs or one and other ways to engage our students? And through that, they need our support and our affirmation and our appreciation. So as we go into this as a partner and they see us as that partner, our mindset is as important as our approach.
And real quick, this is Kevin. I just want to piggyback off that really quickly from the legal counsel perspective. I think what Steve and Colin are saying is so vital. And of course, this is absolutely about growth. This is about helping them improve, all that good stuff. But the approach is a huge piece of that from the legal perspective, because I will tell you, not all evaluations go well. Not all of them go smoothly. And if the approach is one that has got those boxing gloves on and is very combative, those are the ones that very often end up with a grievance, with a charge file with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and then we're totally off track. Now we're focusing on all sorts of things that don't have anything to do with growth. They don't have anything to do with delivering curriculum in an effective way to students, and we're focused on the battle. We're focused on those boxing gloves. And so, of course, Steve makes a great point about that, as does Colin, about it being best practice. That's the way we build teachers up most effectively. But there are very practical benefits in the long run as well, that we are not spending time and energy battling with charges and complaints and all of these red herrings that have nothing to do with the classroom, simply because we've taken a more collaborative approach. There are layers of benefits to it beyond just helping the teacher become the best teacher possible.
So knowing, Steve, that some of us have these conscious and unconscious biases that influence our interactions, what might we do in collecting evidence to neutralize our biases and create more of a thought partner?
So one of the things that we want to do is we want to look at whole group instruction, small group instruction, one-on-one. Some teachers are using videos from other teachers within the district. Some are using published videos. It doesn't matter what they're using. What we want to look at then is what are they doing within their small group instruction. So we're always looking at what are the students saying and doing and documenting that. What's the teacher saying and doing? What's living within the environment, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's virtual or asynchronous? And how are the students interacting with one another or the content, either in a virtual landscape or face-to-face in a traditional setting? The other one is if we're looking at our online platforms or our LMSs, what we're looking at is the organization and the ease of use. If you haven't had the opportunity yet to look at your teacher's LMSs, just take a look. What are you noticing around consistencies, especially at the secondary level where they have multiple teachers? Organization is key. As we know, our high schools just went virtual, so it has to be organized if the students want to be successful with the content. So let's look at that and then have conversations around what are our next steps as a system to create systems for the students that are effective and efficient. The other one that we're looking at oftentimes is what's the learning target or the learning goal, and is it connected to a standard? As Bob said earlier, that's something that we have to look at when we're doing an observation. We're looking at the task, and is that aligned to the learning target? And the explicit success criteria that the teacher is using or showing. That could be the teacher demonstrating something. It could be an example that the teacher has posted. It could be a think aloud. It could be a modeling of an expectation, whatever it might be. There has to be some type of success criteria so the students can work, if necessary and when necessary, independent of the teacher. The other thing that you might do is look at the recorded lessons. So what does the recorded lesson say, and how is the teacher introducing the lesson? How is the teacher teaching, but also how is the teacher creating relationships with the students through their personality on screen? And we also know this, if we're creating videos, the research says that they should be in between probably 3 to 6 minutes in length. Any more than 6 minutes in length, there's a drastic decline in the way that people pay attention to it. So the shorter, the better, which means we want things in snippets. A lot of this goes back to some things teachers just aren't aware of, and we have to build their consciousness around it. So how do we work beside them and grow them, show them the resource, and praise what they are doing and figure out their next steps to success? If we're truly going to give effective and efficient feedback, what we want to think about are a few things. Let's stop writing it in a context that it looks like we're writing a report for central office. Because if we're doing that, it truly is for central office, and we're doing it for compliance. If we truly want to grow practice, we're going to write a letter to the teacher. So we're just going to say something like this. Hey, Kevin, Colin, Wendy, and Bob, thanks for all you do to continually support the educators and the administrators throughout the state of Michigan. We start it in the same way I would start a letter to my grandma. Then we move into evidence and affirmations. We name the evidence explicitly. It's not our bias. It's what is seen. We start with you or your students, and we follow it by the result or the impact. We often use rubric language with this so that it's not this exterior thing. It actually gets the teachers to go back to the rubric, and then we create a common vocabulary. So it might sound something like this. Wendy, you had participants introduce themselves in the chat and welcomed everybody to the session. This led to people feeling welcomed and also set up the context so that they could use the Q&A as well as the chat to have their questions answered. I'm not saying good job or you're a rock star. I'm naming the evidence and I'm following it by an articulate, connected affirmation. I might say, Kevin, Colin, and Bob, you named the statutory requirements and also gave things to think about through the lens of what's required and what's flexible. This resulted in people figuring out what they have control over and what they must do in relationship to teacher observation and evaluation. We're simply naming the evidence and affirming the practice. We always want to wrap it up with a closing then. Thanks for all you do. We put our personality into this piece. You've got this. It's just the encourager at the end. The last thing we want to do is this right here, is walk beside the teacher to figure out the next steps, connected to the areas of focus that they wanted to zero in on. You can see that there's various sentence stems that we can work through because they're based on the intensity and the skill and will of the teacher that we're working with. It might sound like as you work to grow your practice, something you'll want to consider is, we also want to brainstorm these with a teacher face-to-face often so that we have clarity over those expectations. Because oftentimes if a teacher isn't doing it, it's because they don't have clarity over what we're actually asking them to do. So it has to be specific and targeted enough that they can do it tomorrow and they can feel success, so they're running back to us and they're excited to implement it. This is typically the way that we leave feedback. Colin, you want to jump in with thoughts?
I think the key piece that you modeled for us, Steve, is you took out all the superlatives, you took out I, and you designated the actual evidence within which you are passing along. So I know from Kevin's point of view, if whether it's dealing with any type of arbitration or mediation, or if you have to go to a tenure act, what people appreciate is evidence-based evaluation. So it's not about what I thought with my own biases or thoughts, but it's based on the evidence. And so by naming what the teacher did do descriptively and specifically, and either coming up with a next step or having the teacher come up with the next step, it grounds it within their IDP and their areas of focus. It's strength-based, and it creates ownership amongst the team as a partnership versus an opponent. And it's so important we do that. Too much superlatives are praise, not feedback, or put downs versus feedback. So recognizing what a teacher did, because whatever a teacher is doing, the best they can. They're not holding back their best for another day. So whatever they're doing now is a good place to be. How do we help them to grow their practice, regardless of where they are on this continuum? Our job is to help them be their best selves for their students.
And we're also not shying away from difficult conversations when those difficult conversations need to happen, which means if we're truly having multiple difficult conversations, then the person might need to go on an IDP mid-year, which means it's going to be very clear as to what we're working on and how we're going to get there together. So a few other things as you even think about feedback. The first one is make sure that it's part of a daily routine, meaning we have it scheduled, or even down to I pull 5 teachers' names out of a hat, and those are the 5 teachers that I observe for 5 minutes, and I give them effective and efficient feedback. Sometimes I can give that feedback, pick up my phone and just smile at them and talk to my phone and then send it to them via text so they can see and hear my voice. Sometimes we do it in a written format. You decide. The other one is it has to be focused on a goal. Too many goals don't get accomplished. Let's narrow our focus and zero it in on 1 or 2 things or 3 or 4 things specifically around the teachers to affirm and grow their practice. Let's let teachers decide what those areas of focus are, if possible, at all times, so that they own it and we can work around it. The next one is
that. If I could, real quick, Steve, just interject on that one. When we say goal focus, your IDPs are supposed to have specific performance goals. So are your specific performance goals within your IDP or your areas of focus aligned to your rubric? So as we're giving this goal-focused feedback, it should be connected back to what they're working on in their practice. So if I'm working on, in Steve's case, student engagement and getting students to talk, and he can provide interactions that way. Or if I'm working on establishing the purpose of a lesson or changing the identity of a student so they're looking at themselves as learners and not just consumers of content, making sure my feedback fits into what we agreed to in our IDP or in our growth plan is critical.
These are all things we have control over as well. So when we say we don't have control over a lot in education, we have full control over these pieces. Use it to your advantage, create your new identity, and support teachers. The other one is we talked about is it has to be strengths-based. Our brain is wired to see deficit. Let's look at what the person is doing versus what they're not doing and grow their practice within that. The other one is it has to be timely. I don't know about you, but right now, if it's not done within 5 to 10 minutes or within 24 hours, I'm not paying attention to it. So when the law says we can wait 30 days, I'm telling you what, you wait 2 days and it's out of my mind, out of my sight. So the faster and the more quickly we can give it timely feedback, the better. These conversations don't have to last real long. If they're oral and if written, we can send it immediately after we observe. Put it on a sticky note. Record yourself, put it into your system that you're currently using, but make the feedback timely. The other one is it's all about reciprocal learning. If I'm going to go in and I'm going to observe teachers and provide feedback, I also want them to observe me and give me feedback. I also want them to know what I'm working on in the realms of feedback and communication so that they can give me feedback on my feedback and say, is it working for them? Because if it's not working for them, there's no sense in doing it. So keep asking them what's working, what's not working, what do they appreciate, what would they appreciate more or less of? And it's a team partnership that we're all in it together. The final one that's up there is we have to create clarity before accountability. And oftentimes this is where disagreements begin, is that we're asking somebody to do it and they had very different misconceptions or very different ideas around what we're asking them to do than actually what they are doing or what they were expected to do. So remember, we're always seeking clarity and understanding before we can hold anybody, even ourselves, accountable to the next steps. That being said,
I think one of the things to keep in mind is what we talked about in the spring during a pandemic learning, and all of us focus on Maslow's before Bloom's. How are we as learners focusing on our teachers before ratings? How do we support them through observation and feedback, as Steve has mentioned, rather than providing a rating and focus there? Our approach will be mirrored by our students or by our teachers. And so as our teachers approach our students, we don't need them just quizzing and testing kids. We need them formatively assessing and providing feedback. If we want our teachers to do that with our students, we need our principals doing that with our teachers. So with that,
close us out, just remember that at the end of all of this, at the end of the year, your evaluation does need to assign one of 4 effectiveness ratings. It can do so much more than that, but at a minimum, the state law requires that it assign one of 4 effectiveness ratings. It has to include specific performance goals developed in consultation with that teacher for the 21-22 school year, and identify recommended training to assist in achieving those goals. Remember that within your evaluation, I mentioned this earlier, and I just want to hit on it briefly here at the end. There are the BB factors to consider potentially. These are also referred to as the factors in 1248. These are things that you can potentially use as tiebreakers, or there are other ways to use these within your evaluation, but essentially any portion of your evaluation that isn't otherwise covered by growth or educator practice, you would use you have to include at least these factors in your evaluation, and those come from State Statute Section 1248. One other thing I did want to add, because there was a question about it that came up, is we've talked a lot about evaluation, and there's a question about is it going to be waived? Is evaluation going to be waived this year? I just want to note that everything is pointing right now to lame duck being pretty lame, being very underproductive, and it seems very unlikely that anything will change with evaluation during the lame duck session. That means that given the time it'll take for them to ramp up next year, it seems unlikely that anything will change with evaluation until mid to late spring. Why that matters? There could be some sort of waiver of evaluation eventually, but whether there is or isn't, it will not come in time to change what you need to do during the school year this year in order to comply with state statute, because it seems very, very unlikely that state statute will change soon enough to change your practice. So best practice right now would be to go forward. Sorry, Colin, go ahead.
So said differently, if you've been waiting for somebody to wave a wand, sprinkle pixie dust or something else to change the law, you've missed the boat. You need to start now. And I hate to say it this way, but you need to start observing and providing feedback now if you haven't already. For any of your first year teachers and anybody who was rated less than effective last year, come January, we should be doing mid-year reviews, which means you have to at least have one observation in order to have that piece going on. So don't wait, because by the time you have a decision one way or the other, it's going to be too late to fulfill some of these other requirements. So every teacher who's in their first year must have that mid-year review. Anybody who was less than effective last year must have a mid-year review. Any teacher who's probationary, for those of you saying, hey, I hired some teacher, they're in their second or third year, but they've been effective. Well, if you don't have an IDP, you need to get that done now. A question came up about professional growth plans versus IDPs. Although the statute in the Tenure Act talks about individualized development plans that we often refer to as IDP, nothing in statute says you have to call it that. So whether you call it a growth plan, an individualized development plan, a professional growth plan, a corrective action plan, that's all local language. It's all the same thing. What are my specific performance goals? What are my measurements of success? What recommended instruction, coaching, support do you need in order to meet there? And then the observation and feedback piece comes in, and how we go from that end. With that said, we did have a couple other questions beyond evaluation. The first one had to do with, has MASSP inquired, responded or questioned the state in regards to the grants that are being given to teachers and support staff from the last school year? These grants are not being offered to administrators who put in many hours of work and meetings, getting things in order for students and parents as the school went remote. Where are we at with that, and what's the impact for administrators?
Well, I mean, clearly we know that there's no doubt that administrators deserve well more than just the $500 grant that's being offered to teachers and the $250 that's offered to support staff. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Unfortunately, this this was dropped into the budget by Republicans, possibly before the election for a purpose. And then it just kind of got moved quickly along, and then also by the governor's office. And so there really wasn't an opportunity of much for the administrative groups to be able to protest. We did, MASSP and MASA for that matter, the Superintendent's Association, inquire about why administrators weren't included in that. I think there was definitely in effort to offer that specifically to the unions. And I think you can draw your own conclusions about why that is. But just so you're aware, Sue, obviously something like that's not going to come up. And you know, MASSP isn't just going to sit mum and not try to advocate. But I think there was a lot of underlying political thoughts behind that overture. And I don't know if Bob wants to add anything to that.
The only thing I'd add to that is to note that the language that provided a grant to teachers was originally included as a supplemental piece, dropped in over the summer. There was a negative supplemental back to balance last year's budget, and that's when the teacher piece first appeared. And that was done at the 11th hour. And at that point, we started talking about, okay, yeah, I get it. You want to do something nice for teachers, but you know, there are a lot of other school employees out there that deserve recognition for their work. Okay, yeah, we'll look at that. And then the second piece that expanded it to include support staff was dropped in again at the 11th hour without anybody in the field having a chance to read it. And we finally got the language on that the day the budget was voted on. So at that point, there just really wasn't any time to get them to change it. And when we tried, we were told that the bottom line was already set. So
in closing, thank you for joining us. We do have resources available that are connected with this. And when you get the email, you'll have that, including the epidemic orders, keeping schools safe, as well as some common teacher evaluation issues that are being faced, FAQs around that, and links to the specific statutes themselves for those who love to read legalese like Mr. Sutton here, and including an FAQ that way. So thank you for joining us. Please note that we have been providing these leaders to leaders for no charge to our members and others. We hope that for those who don't have membership with us now, if you would consider at least an associate membership moving forward by going to massp.com/membership. Also note, we have several webinars that we've been hosting throughout the year. So if you're interested in upcoming events, please visit massp.com/events for any of our virtual things, including a student legislative day that's coming up here in December for our students, and our assistant principal summit in January. And there's more to come around a virtual career fair later this winter that our students are able to engage in. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for what you do on behalf of the teachers, students, and community that you serve. What you do matters. Thank you very much.